I called my wife while her lover was with her in the hotel. They were shocked. I already knew they were together. I already had all the proof, every detail, every lie. She told me every senseless excuse. Every night, she pretended to be too tired to talk, to touch me, to look me in the eyes. I knew it. Yet I could hear her voice shaking on the phone, trying to hide it, pretending nothing was happening. The silence on the other end of the line was enough. The weight of the betrayal dripped into the air like poison, as if she herself felt the cold blade of her own guilt pressing against her throat. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't the man who would be humiliated in that story. I had already planned everything. I already knew exactly how this game would end. And it wouldn't be if I played the fool. My heart was beating to the rhythm of a storm, withholding with every second that passed. It relived. It started to move away from me like I was a ghost inside our house. The ridiculous excuses, the deleted messages on the phone, the strange scent on your clothes, the showers that lasted too long, the way you started to get ready to go out, but without never seemed pretty. I noticed the furtive glances at the phone, the spark of adrenaline in her eyes. When she texted, I saw it. But she thought I hadn't seen it. I thought she was playing tricks on me, that she might shape me, leave me in the shadows, while she gave herself to another man. But I saw it, and I waited. I built my plan while my wife whispered my name on the phone, pretending to be normal, pretending not to be naked under another man in a cheap hotel, where I thought she'd never get caught. My mind was working. She thought this betrayal was a game where only she and he had the cards. But I was the one who held the rules of this game. I would change the situation, because betrayal has a price, and she wasn't willing to pay it. I remember the exact moment I started putting the pieces together. The first suspicious message, the mismatched times, the work meetings that never existed. I didn't confront, I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I just watched. I let her sink in alone, to give herself more and more to her lover, without even imagining that I was there in control of everything. I knew that one day the perfect opportunity would present itself. I knew that one day she would feel safe enough to make the fatal mistake. And that day the phone arrived. It was on speakerphone. I wanted to hear the fear in her voice, the sound of the lover's silence in the background, completely static, trying to figure out if they'd really been caught. I could imagine the scene, both of them naked bodies, sweating from a betrayal that no longer had any pleasure, only desperation. She hesitated, then nervously fought, trying to sound casual. Hello, love. Her voice was sweet, forced. My stomach turned. How did she still have the courage to call me that? But I remained calm. Don't give up on me. It's not okay. Yet I asked with a voice full of calculated coldness, where are you? She stammered. He tried to improvise some lies, but he was weak, pathetic. Every word that came out of his mouth sounded like shattered glass, like a collapsing house of cards. And the silence in the background, the silence of the other man, was the confirmation that they knew they'd been caught. They knew the game was over. But what they didn't know was that I wouldn't let them go with a foolish excuse and false excuses. They wouldn't pay, and the price would be high. He tried to change the subject. I tried to get going. Honey, why are you calling me so late? But his voice was shaking. The desperation was overflowing, and I savored every second of it. My silence was his torture. The lover didn't say anything. He was probably sitting on the edge of the bed with his eyes wide open, wondering if he should run or face the situation. But running would be useless. There was nowhere else to run. I held back my laughter. He still thought he could turn the tables, that he could control the narrative, manipulate, convince me it was all just a misunderstanding. But I already knew everything. I had the photos, the audios, the messages, the concrete evidence of his betrayal. But most of all, I had something she would never have expected: my decision not to be the victim in this story. She thought I would suffer, that I would cry, that I would beg for explanations, that I would ask why. But the truth was that I had enough before I even picked up the phone and dialed his number. The only thing that what kept me there in that context was the desire to savor the moment, exactly when her life would fall apart, the moment when she would realize that she would lose everything, and that I already had one foot out of this story, that I was ready to start over, and that unlike her, in the end I would still have something precious, my dignity, and something that she could never get back. My love, revenge would come, but not in a predictable way, not in a cliché way. It would be calculated, cold, irreversible, and when she least expected it, she would realize that the betrayal had not been the worst mistake she had made. Her worst mistake was believing that I would not know how to get back on my feet, that I would be left there stuck in mourning while she and her lover moved on. But I would not be a broken man. I would be a free man, and the cruelest irony would realize at the moment she realized that it was too late, and the lover would also have his part in the game because when you choose to enter into a story of betrayal, you have to be prepared for the consequences. And the consequences were coming one by one. The game was just started. But only I knew how it would end. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal is not romanticized and will never be justified. Our stories are imaginary, but the pain, the impact, and consequences of infidelity are real. The goal is to show how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships, and leaves scars that never go away. So get ready for an intense story, full of twists and bitter truths. Are you ready? Because this story will shock you. David and Emily were the couple everyone admired. Together for almost 10 years, they built a life that seemed unshakable. He was a methodical man, always attentive to stability, planning, and the security that a well-structured home can give. She was lighter, more spontaneous, always with a ready smile, balancing her seriousness with sweetness. If someone observed them from the outside, they would see a solid marriage based on respect and complicity. David worked in the financial sector, an environment that required precision and control, and brought this into his personal life. I like to have everything in order, from household finances to the most mundane details of daily life. Emily, on the other hand, had a more artistic soul. She loved taking photographs, moments that sometimes you don't. He could see he had a different vision of life, a more fluid way of seeing things. He saw life as a straight and well-paved road where you plan your destination and follow it without deviations. He saw life as a path full of unexpected curves, where the important thing was to enjoy the landscape. For years, this difference completed them, but little by little it began to create invisible cracks. The routine arrived without asking permission. At the beginning, it seemed like a natural coexistence. The enthusiasm of the first experiences is replaced by commitments, responsibilities, bills to pay, meetings, projects, deadlines. The spark in their eyes when they met at the end of the day became an automatic exchange of quick kisses and banal questions about the day. At the beginning, they were romantic dinners on weekends, unexpected trips, little surprises that showed affection. But over time, these moments became rarer, giving way to a more predictable, almost mechanical coexistence. David, always so dedicated to his work, began to bring home more and more worries, not out of negligence, but because he felt that his obligation was to guarantee both of them a safe future. Emily, in turn, he missed her attention, the lightness they once had. He began to feel invisible, as if she were just another element of the house, and not the woman he had once loved so intensely. He tried to speak, he tried to prove, but the conversations got lost in excuses. He said he was tired, he needed to finish something important, that it wasn't a good time. She smiled. He agreed. He always understood. He understood. The nights became silent. Before, they loved watching movies together, discussing stories, laughing at absurd situations. Now he arrived late with his mind still tied to work. They had dinner without much conversation, and each continued their nightly routine. He has a notebook, she for her photographs. I tried to fill that void by recording beauties that I no longer felt in my life. The room, once a refuge for both of them, became just a shared space. The touch became rarer, the desire vanished. There were no arguments or heated discussions, just silence, a silence full of everything that was never said. Emily started going out more. She looked for friends. She filled her days with exhibitions, coffees, conversations that made her feel alive. She noticed that for him it was less and less important to wait for him first. I prepared elaborate dinners. I left affectionate points. Now he was content to eat anything and lie down without worrying if he would come or not. David noticed the changes, but preferred to believe it was a phase. I didn't see any danger there. He trusted his wife in the relationship they had built. I thought that love was enough to keep everything in place. But love is not just a feeling. Love needs presence. And he wasn't there. One afternoon, he came home early, one rare day, one of those moments when fate seemed to want to give things a chance to change. But Emily wasn't there. For the first time, he noticed that something was different. He touched small details of the house that hadn't caught his attention before. New perfumes on her dressing table, clothes you've never seen her wear, lipstick colors she's never chosen. He sat on the sofa trying to remember when was the last time he looked at his wife. He didn't just see her, he looked at her. He thought about the last conversations, the last times he had made her laugh, the last times he had hugged her without haste. He tried to remember When was the last time he cared if she was happy and realized that she didn't know how to answer? Emily came back that night, different, distant look, smile that seemed forced. She noticed it, but didn't say anything. I just looked, and for the first time he was afraid of what was happening in front of his eyes without him noticing, afraid of missing something without even knowing exactly what it was. And at that moment he decided to pay more attention, but there was still time. David began to notice Emily's absences more closely. Small details that before seemed irrelevant began to become pieces of a puzzle that he didn't want to put together at first. I tried to justify it. Maybe she was just busy. Maybe she spent more time with her friends. Maybe she was just looking for something for herself. But something inside him screamed that it wasn't just that. He noticed that when she went out, she always carefully checked her cell phone in advance. When she received messages, her expression changed, as if she was reading something she couldn't share. The times began to deviate from the routine they had before. Emily came home at the same time. They had dinner together, even in silence. But they were always in the same space. Now, there were nights when she didn't even warn that she was going to be late, and when he asked, the answers were vague, distracted. And every time he tried to bring it up, it felt like he wanted to end the conversation as quickly as possible. David's intuition started to turn into something more concrete. He decided to try it. One of the nights, she said she was going out to meet a friend. He waited, looked at the clock. It was 11 past midnight. 1 in the morning. Called, call rejected, sent a text, no response. Something inside him, it started to burn, a tightness in his chest that mixed with anger and anguish. I felt like I was losing control of my life. When Emily finally came through the door, smiling as if nothing was wrong, the smell of the perfume was too strong, different from what she was wearing. She didn't look at him directly when she came in, as if she was purposely avoiding his gaze. David didn't ask. I just looked. The next day, he decided to act differently. If he really was hiding something, it would give her the illusion that he didn't suspect anything. Emily started going out more often, always well-groomed, always with rehearsed excuses. What once had been sporadic outings are now fixed commitments. Deep down, David was still trying to convince himself that he could be wrong, that maybe he was just making up stories in his head. But then came the confirmation that he feared. One night while Emily was sleeping, he took her cell phone. Her heart was beating fast. Her breathing was tense. He had never done it. He had never felt the need to invade his wife's privacy. But right there in that moment, I needed to know. I easily unlocked the device and started scrolling through the messages. Her name was there, a contact saved without a last name, but it didn't take long to understand what it meant. He opened the conversation and found what he didn't want to see: messages exchanged at times when he was at home, intimate words, promises, laughter, phrases that were once said to him, photos, statements. The betrayal wasn't just physical. There was something more, an already rooted involvement, built, fueled by months of lies. David felt the floor disappear. The betrayal wasn't just an isolated act. It wasn't a one-night stand. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. She chose to deceive him. She chose to build something with another man while he was there in the same house, believing they were still married. The blood boiled. He felt his stomach turn. The pain of seeing that everything he thought was solid, everything he had built, was just an illusion. He looked at Emily sleeping next to him, serene, peaceful, as if nothing was happening, as if nothing was being destroyed. He got up, went to the bathroom, and looked at himself in the mirror. That man I saw there was not the same as before. Something inside him was changing. The pain began to give way to something bigger, something he still didn't know how to name, but that wouldn't let him be the loser in this story. He needed proof. I needed to know more. Emily still believed he was unaware that he wasn't suspicious, and this played in his favor. In the following days, David remained calm. He continued with his routine without arousing suspicion, without showing that he knew. But inside, every detail was analyzed. When he went out, he kept track of the places he went. I kept every piece of information. One of these nights, he decided to follow her. He drove slowly, keeping his distance, with the headlights off. Emily parked near a discreet hotel. Not very luxurious, but comfortable enough for those who seek discretion. He saw her get out of the car, fix her hair, and take one last look at the reflection on the window before getting in. The blood boiled. But he didn't move, just waited. Time passed, and then the hotel door opened again, and there he was, the other man, tall and confident, a satisfied smile on his lips. As he looked around before getting in the car, David didn't need anything else. The betrayal was complete. It was no longer a doubt. It was real. It was in front of him, completely open, with no possibility of lying, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling his fingers tingling. But that wasn't the time to act. He didn't have everything he needed yet, and now he was in control. When Emily came home that night, she found David on the couch watching television. As if nothing had happened, he looked at her without showing any emotion. "I just looked at." Emily smiled, said she was tired, and went straight to her room. David followed her with his eyes, feeling the weight of the truth that she now carried with her. But he had no idea, and that was what made it all the more interesting. He still thought he had the power to lie, but the game was about to change, and she didn't even suspect it. David knew there was no point acting in the heat of emotions. The betrayal was already came, which meant that his only advantage was to keep control, plan every step with coolness. He wouldn't be the man who would lose everything, who would come out of this story as a loser. He wanted more than just a confrontation. I wanted something that would make Emily feel the weight of the choice she had made firsthand. The worst part of betrayal wasn't just the pain of being deceived, but the fact that the other person continued living as if nothing had happened. She wouldn't allow it. The next few days were a kind of silent game. Emily continued with her lies, believing she still had the situation under control. David remained impassive, calculating every detail until finally the right moment came. One night, he came home early, strangely calm. He found Emily distracted on the couch, looking at her cell phone, probably exchanging messages with her lover. He slowly approached, feeling the adrenaline running through his veins. He didn't even look up until he stopped right in front of her. The tension in the air was evident. Emily smiled automatically, trying to appear calm, but there was something in David's expression that made her hesitate. He asked if he was okay, if something had happened. He didn't answer right away. He put his phone on the table and swiped his finger across the screen until it opened the photos, the messages, the evidence of his infidelity. Emily froze, her eyes scanning her skin breathlessly. She turned pale. She tried to speak, but her voice broke before she could make any excuses. David didn't look away, waiting. I wanted to see the truth appear on her face. I wanted to see her sink into the despair of her own lie. But Emily was quick. She held her breath and began to deny, saying it was nothing, that everything could be explained. But she didn't want explanations. She wanted the truth, and this time she wouldn't accept it. Nothing less. It was then that, in a fit of desperation, she tried to turn the situation around. She tried to turn her guilt into an accusation against him. She asked how he got that information, why he was spying, how he had the courage to touch her phone, as if it were his fault for finding out what she was trying to hide. David's laughter was bitter. There was no more patience for manipulation games. He interrupted her with a coldness that made her shiver. There was no more room for pretense. I wanted her to say it out loud, to admit what she had done. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily hesitated, took a deep breath, and then for the first time she admitted, but not with an apology, not with sincere regret, but with the resignation of someone who has been cornered. She said that yes, there was someone else who hadn't planned it, who didn't want to hurt him, but it happened. But the words were empty, artificial, as if she had only said them because there was no other way. David should have felt relieved after hearing the confession, but what came out was emptiness. He already knew the truth, but hearing it from her, seeing in her eyes the lack of real guilt, the lack of real pain for having destroyed everything, was like the final blow. And it was there, in that moment, that he understood something. It wasn't just about the betrayal. There was something more that hadn't been revealed. Yet because Emily still seemed to be holding on to something, one last secret that she didn't want to say, it was then that he decided to push her to the limit. He asked directly, "I wanted to know everything. I wanted to know how far it is that lie came." Emily hesitated. She didn't expect him to want more than a simple confession. And then, in the midst of desperation, she blurted out, "The betrayal wasn't recent. It wasn't a passing fling. It wasn't a mistake of a few months. She had been involved with this man for a long time, long enough for this to not be just a mistake." But the real blow came after the secret that David wasn't expecting. Emily's lover wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone she had never met. It was someone who had been a part of your life for years, who was a part of your history, someone she trusted. It was your best friend. The betrayal wasn't just from the woman she loved. It was from the man she considered a brother, the person you shared important Moments with that you believed in, who helped you when you needed it. The shock was immediate. Her heart was pounding, her hands were shaking. What was just a betrayal with equals turned into something much bigger. Emily saw the impact his words had. She saw the change in his eyes, and she knew there was no going back. David felt breathless. All that he had lived for the past few years began to rebuild himself in his mind from a new perspective. Every moment, every meeting, every conversation, every time they had dinner together, they laughed, they shared stories. It was a farce. He wasn't just sleeping next to a woman who was cheating on him. He was spending his days interacting with someone who was cheating on him, pretending to be his friend. Emily tried to talk. She tried to justify herself. She said she never wanted it to be this way. She never had the courage to tell him because she knew it would hurt him more than anything. But it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. The lies became unbearable. The weight of the betrayal was too great to ignore. David looked at Emily, as if he didn't recognize her anymore, as if the woman he had married had become a complete stranger. The silence between them was an irreparable abyss. He stood up slowly, took a deep breath. Emily watched, waiting for some explosion, some violent reaction, but it didn't come. The coldest look she had ever seen. And then she said the only thing that still made sense. She didn't need to worry. She knew everything now. But what she didn't know was that the game wasn't over. Yet Emily stood still, feeling the weight of those words crashing down on her. You shouldn't have worried. How could she say that after all that had been exposed? Her chest was rising and falling at a frantic pace, as if she was desperately searching for a justification that could ease the devastation in David's eyes. But there was no justification. There was nothing she could say that would erase what she had done. She knew everything, and now he looked at her as if it were nothing, a mistake, a waste of years. The only thing more devastating than someone's anger is indifference. And that was what she was starting to feel from him. David looked away, walked slowly into the kitchen, and filled a glass of water. His gestures were slow, calculated, as if he was holding something inside that couldn't be released. Yet Emily followed him with her eyes, not daring to move. The silence between them was like a minefield where every word could be the final explosion. But she didn't speak. She just took a sip of water, and then turned the glass between her fingers, as if the simple gesture was more interesting than the woman who once he swore he loved. He tried to break the barrier. I said his name softly, almost like a plea for mercy. But he didn't even react. Emily didn't know what to expect. He didn't scream. He didn't confront her any more than he already had, and that made her even more nervous. If he exploded, if he broke something, if he did something rash, it would be easier to deal with him. But his coldness was a silent warning that what came next would be much worse than a simple outburst of anger. David finally broke the silence. He asked her if she loved the other man. He asked like someone who already knew the answer, but wanted to hear it from her. He wanted to see her fight. He wanted to taste the bitter taste of the truth spat from those lips that had said they loved him so many times. Emily tried to dodge him, but he wouldn't let her. He said he wanted to hear it. He said he didn't want any more excuses or lies, just the truth, because if he couldn't say it now, all that talking would be useless. Emily swallowed. He hesitated, but finally he answered. I didn't know. He said what he felt was confusing, that he didn't. There was no way to compare the two, that he hadn't planned it, that it just happened. But with every word that came out of his mouth, David was just confirming what she already suspected. He had no regrets for what he had done. He only felt remorse for being found out. He laughed a short, humorless laugh and said that was the most predictable answer he could have given. Emily shifted uncomfortably, feeling completely exposed. She tried to get closer, but he raised her, preventing any attempt at contact. He said he didn't want her to touch him anymore, that privilege he had given up to someone else, that now all that was between them was the end. She insisted. She tried to say that she didn't want them to end like this, that wasn't what she wanted for them. But David just raised his eyebrow and asked her if at any point she had thought of him while she was with the other person. He asked her if he had ever stopped and wondered how she felt during those hidden meetings. She wondered what would happen when everything came to light. Emily tried to answer, but the words, they died in the throat, because no, he hadn't thought of it. And now it was too late. David left the glass on the counter and walked over to the door. He grabbed the car keys and said he had to leave. Emily was scared. She was afraid of what that meant. She asked where he was going, but he just said he'd know soon. She stood there alone in the room, feeling the panic rising inside her. She grabbed the phone. She thought about calling him, but something held her back. Something in his gaze before he left made her realize it wasn't going to be that simple. And then after minutes that seemed like hours, the answer came. Her phone vibrated. On the table, a message. But not from David, from the other one. The message was short, almost impatient. She wanted to know what was happening. I wanted to know if David knew, if he'd say something. Emily felt her heart race. She typed something quickly, saying she needed to talk to him in person. But before she could send it, the phone screen lit up again, a new message. But this time it was from David. Emily felt her stomach drop. When she opened it, it wasn't a conventional message. It was a photo of David sitting in a bar, in front of someone, and that someone was the other man, Emily. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. David didn't go to a motel and destroy everything in a fit of rage. He didn't go to a friend's house to seek comfort. He went straight to him, the man she cheated on him with, the man she thought of as a brother. Emily called David immediately, but the call went to voicemail. I tried again, nothing. She looked at the phone screen, the photo, David's cold smile, next to the one who had helped her destroy their marriage. What was he doing? What were you planning? Fear took over her. For the first time, she felt completely out of control. And then, like the final blow, came David's final text. You've made your choice. Now look what happens next. Emily felt her whole body shake. The phone was still shaking in her hands. The screen lit up with that final text from David. One final cold phrase. You've made your choice. Now look what happens next. Her heart was beating so hard it seemed to echo in her ears, drowning out everything else around it. The once familiar room suddenly felt like a strange space, a place she didn't belong more. She walked from one side to the other, trying to organize her thoughts, trying to figure out how far he would go. You must have called the mailbox again, tried once again, nothing. She wrote desperate messages, but they all went unanswered. I felt like I was in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. She was with the other one, and the worst thing is that she knew everything. She took the car key and left without thinking. She was driving at high speed without a precise destination, guided only by the instinct that she needed to avoid what was about to happen. The city passed before her in a mix of light and shadow, but her mind could only focus on one thing: David sitting in front of her, this man she had allowed into her life in a way that should never have happened. What they were talking about, what he had said, she knew that. At that moment, Emily was trying to avoid something that could already be out of her control. When she got to the bar, she saw David's car parked across the street. Her chest tightened. She didn't think twice before getting out of the vehicle and quickly crossing the sidewalk, almost tripping in her haste. His hands were shaking as he opened the door. The atmosphere was suffocating, full of conversations scattered with the smell of alcohol mixed with cigarettes, but none of it mattered. His eyes scanned the space until he found her. There they were. David was sitting too, relaxed, a calculated smile on his lips, while the other looked uncomfortable, his fingers nervously tapping the glass of whiskey in front of him. Something was happening there, something much bigger than Emily could understand. Her lover. He saw her first, and the look of panic that crossed his face was enough to make David smile even more. She approached with her heart pounding. David looked at her, and in that instant he knew she was already much further ahead. It wasn't an impulsive meeting. He didn't go there without a plan. He wanted her to see. I wanted her to be there to witness whatever was about to happen. Emily called his name almost in a voiceless way. David tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the scene with interest. Before finally speaking, he asked her if she was surprised to find them there. He asked her if she really thought he would stay home, accepting everything with his head down. The lover of fools. The look tensed, the muscles of the face contracted with nervousness. Asked them to talk somewhere else, not to do it there. But David just smiled and asked why. After all, they were not ashamed of meeting so many times, of hiding, of betraying him by pretending loyalty. Then why now suddenly should he worry about preserving some sort of dignity for them? Emily looked at the other, waiting for him to say something, but she was in shock. She knew that there were no arguments that would free him from that situation. David leaned back in the chair, twirling the glass between his fingers. He said he was not there to fight. I did not want screams or scenes. It was not worth it. I already understood everything I needed, and above all, she had already made her decision. She tried to argue. She tried to ask them to leave there, but David interrupted her with a frightening calm. He said that the conversation was not about her, that at that moment she was only a spectator of her own mistake. Then she turned to the other and asked him if he knew what loyalty meant. She understood the weight of trust. Someone asked him what was going through his mind every time he looked into his eyes while he was sleeping with his wife. He asked if at any point he felt guilty, or if he simply believed that it would never have consequences. The lover remained silent without the courage to answer. David chuckled, shaking his head. He said that deep down he has always known that betrayals do not begin with big events, but with small acts, small deviations of character, small moments. When someone chooses to put their pleasure above all else, Emily gasped, feeling the impact of those words, like a sharp blade piercing her chest. Then David took something out of his pocket and put it on the table. An envelope, the other one looked suspicious. Emily felt panic rise in her throat. David smiled and said that there was all the evidence, the photos, the messages, the records, everything printed, catalogued, irrefutable, the naked and raw truth. Emily couldn't breathe. The other one took the envelope with shaking hands, opened it, and leafed through the contents. Her face was transforming. Panic was taking over every trait. David waited patiently as he took in the reality, then finally spoke. He said, "He didn't want anything from that man. I didn't want excuses. I didn't want explanations. I just wanted him to know that his life would never be the same after that night, because the moment he got up from that table, the moment he walked out that door, what was inside that envelope would become public." His lover's eyes widened. His breathing became short. Emily tried to intervene, but David completely ignored her. David, he got up his jacket and said he had spent too much time sitting at that table, that now he had better things to do. Then he looked at Emily one last time, and in that look he knew he had lost everything. Without saying anything else, David walked away, leaving behind the chaos he had painstakingly planned. And while Emily and her lover stood there still, devastated by the weight of what had been done, the only thing that echoed in her mind was that David didn't look back. He would never look back. Emily sat there breathing hard, her eyes still fixed on the door. David had walked out of the room. Surroundings seemed to slowly spin, as if time had lost all real meaning. The envelope was still on the table, the papers scattered next to her lover's untouched whiskey glass, who now had her hands pressed against her temples, trying to process the chaos that had just followed. The bar continued to ion around them. The voices and laughter seemed distant, unaware of the disaster unfolding before them. Emily felt a lump in her throat, an irrational urge to run after David, but her legs were tied to the floor, heavy, unable to move. The other man finally looked up, his eyes wide, furious and terrified at the same time. He threw the papers on the table with force, frustration written all over his face. He asked her what the hell David wanted, if he was just joking, or if he really meant to ruin everything. Emily tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. Her lover slams her hand on the table, making the envelope slide a little, making the papers even messier. She said she couldn't let this happened. She needed to find out what he was planning. David leaned across the table, and his fingers gripping the glass of whiskey so tightly it felt like it was about to break. Emily blinked a couple of times, trying to regroup her thoughts. She looked around, feeling the mounting pressure of what would happen next. If David made good on his threat, everything would change. And not just for her. The other man had a lot to lose, much more than just a lover. And it was then that Emily realized that for the first time he was only thinking about himself, not about saving her, not about trying to find a solution for both of them, just to avoid your own ruin. She took a deep breath and finally found the strength to speak. She said she didn't know what David would do, that he didn't know how far he would go. But as soon as those words came out, something inside her writhed in despair, because deep down she knew exactly what was going to happen. David never made empty threats, never a lover. She jumped up, running her hands through her hair, pacing back and forth, muttering to herself, doing mental calculations, imagining alternatives. Emily looked at him, but it felt like she was seeing a stranger. He didn't look at her. He didn't ask her how she was. He didn't offer her any kind of support. He was worried about himself, same. And in that moment, a brutal reality came to her. If David had really revealed everything, he would have simply left her behind without hesitation. Emily felt something break inside her. All the nights of the clandestine meetings, all the whispered promises, all the moments when she thought maybe he was feeling something real, everything was falling apart in a matter of seconds. The man she had destroyed her marriage for now only saw her as a burden, a problem to be solved. There was no love there, never was his love. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes full of panic and irritation. He asked her what she intended to do, what was her plan to stop him. Emily gave a humorless laugh, a bitter sound that echoed in her chest. She asked him if, after all, he really expected her to have a solution, if he really thought she could just turn everything around, as if it was a small mistake, a failure, with no major consequences. He snorted irritably, saying he had no time for sentimentality. They needed to act. Emily crossed her arms looking at him with a coldness she didn't know she possessed, then asked what he intended to do. He hesitated. She looked away. She tried to imply that maybe David was still bluffing, that maybe he didn't have the courage to follow through, but the uncertainty in her voice revealed that she didn't believe her own words. She understood what he wanted. He expected her to go find David, beg, cry, do anything to make him give up, that once again she would solve everything for him. But Emily was no longer willing to act as a shield. She slowly stood up, took her bag, and looked him in the eyes one last time. I told him to turn around. If he wanted to save his reputation, he would try to solve the problem himself. Because he was already destroyed, there was nothing left for her to save. And then, without waiting for an answer, she turned and left the bar. The night seemed too cold, or maybe it was just her body in shock. Every step seemed heavy, dragging, as if she was walking on broken glass. She looked around, expecting to see David's car, but it was gone. She picked up the phone and hesitated. I knew any message would go unanswered. But anyway, she dialed the number. She heard the insistent ringing, like a sentence read before the punishment final. Until the end, David's voice answered. It was calm, but full of something impossible to decipher. He asked her what she wanted. Emily took a deep breath. He said she wanted to see him on the other side. There was a long silence. Then finally he said an address, and they hung up. Turning around, he looked at the display with his heart beating wildly. I recognized that place, and it was in that moment that I understood that the worst was yet to come. He got into the car, driving without thinking, with only one goal: to get to him before everything was lost forever. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Maybe it was already too late. Emily was driving at high speed with her fingers tight on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road in front of her. The night seemed darker than usual, and the weight of what was about to happen was suffocating her. The address that David had given her was not unknown. It was an isolated place, a restaurant closed at that hour, an empty parking lot, a space where there would be no witnesses to what was about to be said. The fear was anxiety, but above all there was a latent desperation. I needed to reach him. I needed to understand what he really meant. But above all, I needed to know if there was still something that could be saved. When she parked, she saw that his car was already there. Her heart was pounding against her chest, and she took a deep breath before getting out of the vehicle. She walked hesitantly. Her footsteps echoed on the asphalt. The restaurant door was ajar. She entered, feeling the heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere. And then she saw him. David was sitting at one of the tables in the center of the room, his face serene, but his eyes full of something impossible to decipher. On the table there was a bottle of wine, 2 glasses, but only one was full. He didn't move when he saw her enter. I just waited. Emily approached slowly, not knowing exactly how to start. She sat down in front of him hesitantly. The silence between the two was thick, full of everything that had been broken. Emily tried to speak, but David raised his hand slightly, a subtle gesture that stopped her. She wanted to speak first, and when he finally began, his voice was low, firm, without any hesitation. He asked her if she really thought that after all this, there could still be some return. He asked her if at some point she thought there would be forgiveness. Emily swallowed, tried to tell him that she didn't want forgiveness. She just wanted him to listen to her, to understand that it wasn't something he had planned, that he didn't know how it had all come to this. But David smiled, bitterly shaking his head, as if he had heard all those excuses before. He said he didn't need any more justifications. There was no need for regret. He just wanted to let her know one very simple thing: he was leaving. Emily felt the floor disappear. She asked what he meant by that, but David, he was direct. He wouldn't stay in that city. I wouldn't stay in that life that had been destroyed. The divorce was already underway. He had already made all the preparations, and most importantly, there was already someone waiting for him somewhere else. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She asked if he was already with someone else, if it was all part of a plan to get back at her, but David just smiled asklessly. Without answering directly, he said that life has funny ways of showing new possibilities when you least expect them, and that contrary to what she imagined, not all pain must end. Sometimes the destruction of something bad is just the beginning of something much better. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but fell silent. For the first time, she realizing that David wasn't just reacting to the betrayal. He was already in another phase. He was already rebuilding himself, and nothing he said would changed the situation. He looked at him searching for something familiar, a spark of the man who once loved her. But wasn't there anymore? The dev in front of him was someone different, someone he didn't recognize anymore. Then he stood up, took the full glass, took a last sip, and said that this was the last time they would see each other. And without giving any time for any response, he turned and walked away. Emily, she stood there alone, feeling the weight of everything she had lost. She tried to breathe, but something inside her was suffocating. She tried to process it, but everything seemed to be turning. The betrayal that once seemed like a distant mistake, it was now the final sentence of her own fate. Outside, David got into the car, closed the door, and took a deep breath, looked one last time in the rearview mirror, seeing the restaurant behind him. Then he sped up. His new beginning was now upon us. And Amelia, she stood there looking at the door he had walked out of, knowing that she would never see that man again. I would never hear from him again, his voice. I would never feel his touch again. And worst of all, he would never have the chance to repair what he had destroyed. The end. If you made it this far, leave your opinion on this story in the comments. What do you think of the ending? How would you have acted in the place of the characters? Subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support cheating. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.